I mean, look at it, Ryan said, his voice light, almost playful, as if he were commenting on the weather. We were standing in the parking lot outside the community center, the kind with faded lines and a single struggling tree planted too close to the curb. He nodded toward my car without really looking at me. That Toyota still running, or is it just nostalgia at this point? A few people nearby laughed. Not loudly, just enough to register. The kind of laugh that confirms permission. I held my keys in my hand a second longer than necessary. The metal was warm from my palm. My car sat exactly where I had parked it, clean, unremarkable, older than most things people bragged about these days. Ryan leaned back against his new SUV, arms crossed, pleased with himself. He had driven it here on a whim, he'd said. A short lease. Temporary. Everything about him lately felt temporary, except his confidence. For dropouts, maybe, he added, still smiling, still not angry. I'm surprised you haven't upgraded. Or at least hidden it. Chloe stood beside him, phone already in her hand, eyes flicking from the car to Ryan, then away again. She didn't smile. She didn't need to. Silence can agree without saying so. I didn't respond. Not because I was stunned, or hurt, or searching for words. I simply didn't see a reason to speak. Ryan had always mistaken silence for absence. Of thought. Of position. Of choice. Someone called his name from across the lot. He waved, still grinning, already moving on. The moment passed the way these moments usually do, unexamined, unchallenged, filed away by everyone except the person it landed on. I unlocked my car and sat inside before starting the engine. The dashboard lit up the way it always had. Steady. Predictable. I watched Ryan through the windshield as he continued talking, his gestures wide, his laughter easy. He never looked back. As I pulled out, I caught my reflection in the rearview mirror. Calm. Unchanged. What struck me wasn't the insult itself, but how certain he had sounded. Certainty, I've learned, often comes from not knowing what you're standing on. By the time I saw Chloe again, the parking lot moment had already settled into something else. These things do. They soften at the edges and harden in the center. We were inside the community center now, fluorescent lights humming faintly above us, folding chairs arranged in careful rows. People spoke in low voices, polite voices. The kind meant to show belonging. Chloe stood a few feet away from me, angled just enough that I could see her profile. Her expression hadn't changed since outside. Composed. Neutral. Almost professional. She didn't mention the car. That mattered more than if she had. She looked me over the way someone looks at a resume they've already decided not to read closely. Not dismissive. Just, concluded. Her eyes lingered for a fraction of a second too long on my shoes, then moved on. That pause told me everything. When she finally spoke, it wasn't about Ryan's comment. It was about logistics. Schedules. A fundraiser date. Her tone was smooth, measured, carefully pleasant. She spoke as if we were equals in the room, but not equals in trajectory. I noticed how she kept her phone face down in her palm, thumb resting lightly on the edge, ready to disengage. I nodded where nodding was required. I listened. I always listen. Around us, conversations overlapped. Someone laughed again, this time at something unrelated. The room smelled faintly of old coffee and floor cleaner. Ordinary details. The kind people forget. The kind that anchor moments more firmly than words ever could. My Toyota was visible through the glass doors at the far end of the room. Parked where it had been earlier. Unmoved. Its paint caught the light differently than the newer cars beside it. Not brighter. Just honest. I thought about how long I'd had it. How many mornings it had started without complaint. How many afternoons it had waited without drawing attention to itself. Chloe followed my line of sight for a brief second, then looked away. She said nothing. But the silence was weighted. Judgment doesn't always announce itself. Sometimes it simply assumes agreement. I felt the familiar urge to clarify. To explain. To offer context no one had asked for. It passed quickly. Explanation invites negotiation. And I wasn't negotiating anything. When the meeting ended, Chloe gathered her things efficiently. She smiled at Ryan. She did not smile at me. Not intentionally. Not unkindly. Just accurately, in her own mind. As I walked back to my car, keys steady in my hand, I understood something quietly settling into place. This wasn't about a Toyota. or status, or even Ryan's certainty. It was about timing. And for the first time, I chose to wait. I have lived simply for so long that it no longer feels like a choice. It feels like muscle memory, the kind that forms quietly, over years, when you stop measuring your life against other people's expectations and start measuring it against your own tolerance for noise. I wasn't always this way. There was a time when I noticed labels, when I understood what certain brands signaled to certain rooms. I learned early how quickly attention shifts when you upgrade the surface of your life. But I also learned how temporary that attention is. How easily it evaporates the moment something newer, louder, or shinier enters the frame. What stayed with me wasn't admiration. It was pressure. So I built my life around what didn't ask anything from me. A modest home. Predictable routines. A car that didn't pretend to be more than it was. I never needed my possessions to introduce me. I preferred to arrive quietly and leave the same way. Ryan used to tease me about it even before that afternoon. He called it playing small, though he never explained what game he thought I was avoiding. To him, restraint looked like fear. To me, it felt like control. I noticed things he didn't. The way expenses compound. The way attention attracts obligation. The way visibility invites assumptions. I watched people upgrade their lives and lose flexibility without realizing it. Bigger payments. Louder expectations. Less room to move when things changed. I liked room. The Toyota was part of that. Paid for outright. Maintained on schedule. No surprises. When I turned the key, it started. When I parked it, it waited. There was comfort in that predictability. A kind of quiet partnership. Appearances never mattered much to me because I had learned, slowly and without drama, that they rarely protected anyone when it counted. They distracted. They reassured the wrong people. They created narratives that were hard to step out of once you'd stepped into them. There was one habit I never talked about. Every month, without fail, I reviewed my paperwork. Accounts. Statements. Correspondence. Not obsessively, just thoroughly. It was something my father had impressed upon me years ago, not through lectures, but through example. He believed that responsibility wasn't loud. It was consistent. That habit had followed me into adulthood without much thought. It felt as ordinary as checking the weather before leaving the house. That evening, after the community center emptied and the parking lot lights flickered on, I sat in my car for a moment before starting the engine. I listened to the tick of cooling metal from the vehicles around me. I thought about Chloe's silence. About Ryan's certainty. About how easily people decide who you are based on what you drive. Then I went home and did what I always did at the end of the month. I opened my files. It didn't feel like a turning point at the time. Just another small task in a long list of quiet ones. Michael Avery had a way of standing slightly to the side of things. Not withdrawn. Just observant. He was one of those people who noticed patterns without announcing them, which is why most people underestimated how much he saw. We worked in the same building, different departments, overlapping hours. Our interactions were brief and usually practical. A nod in the hallway. A short exchange near the printer. Neutral ground. That afternoon, he caught up with me near the elevators as people were thinning out for the day. "You always leave on time," he said, not as a judgment. More like a fact he'd been cataloguing. "I try to," I replied. He glanced at my car keys when the elevator doors opened. The Toyota key fob was worn smooth at the edges. He didn't smile, but his eyes lingered for half a second longer than expected. "Reliable," he said. "Underrated quality." It wasn't a compliment people usually offered out loud. Especially not in that building. Especially not after what Ryan had said earlier in the week. Michael hadn't been there for the comment, but absence didn't mean insulation. Things like that travel quickly in professional spaces, reshaped with each retelling. We rode down in silence. The kind that doesn't demand to be filled. Outside, the late afternoon light flattened everything. Cars. Faces. Intentions. Michael paused before heading toward his own vehicle. "Your brother," he said carefully. "He has a reputation." I waited. Not tense. Just still. "Confident," he added. "Very visible." The way he said it made visibility sound like a liability. "He asked questions last month," Michael continued. "About processes. Authority lines. Who signs what?" I felt something shift, not sharply, more like a pressure change. Ryan had never mentioned that. I don't think he realized how much those questions reveal, Michael said. Or who hears them. Ryan wasn't there, but his presence pressed into the conversation anyway. He had that effect. He filled rooms whether he was invited or not. I stay out of most things, Michael went on. But I notice consistency. You have it. It was said plainly. No flattery. No expectation attached. Just an observation offered and then released. I thanked him and turned toward my car. He didn't follow. Didn't add anything else. But as I reached for the door handle, he spoke again. There's a meeting next week, he said. Not public. Internal. Some doors open quietly before anyone realizes they exist. I looked back at him. He didn't elaborate. Didn't need to. Think about it, he added. Then he walked away. I sat in the driver's seat longer than usual that evening. The parking lot was nearly empty now. My phone stayed dark in my bag. No messages. No calls. Just the low hum of the building settling for the night. There are moments when opportunity doesn't announce itself. It waits, half hidden, until you're calm enough to notice the outline of a door that hasn't been opened yet. Ryan's confidence didn't spike all at once. It expanded, like something given room and permission. I watched it happen from a distance I chose to keep. He started speaking more freely in places he once moderated himself. Louder laughter. Broader gestures. Stories told with an audience already assumed. I wasn't part of those stories anymore. That seemed to please him most. At a weekend gathering, he leaned against a high table, drink in hand, telling a small circle how some people never moved on. He didn't use my name. He didn't need to. Chloe stood beside him, polished and approving, her smile tight but aligned. When someone asked how family was doing, Ryan shrugged in a way that suggested closure. She's comfortable, he said. Some people are built for modest lives. The word modest landed where he wanted it to. Heads nodded. A few sympathetic sounds followed. He took them as validation. I stood across the room, unnoticed by design, holding a paper plate I didn't plan to finish. The Toyota comment had already done its work. He assumed silence meant acceptance. He mistook restraint for lack of position. Later, I heard him near the window, voice lowered but still carrying. You can only help people so much, he said. At some point, they choose small. Small. He liked that word. It let him feel large without having to prove anything. What Ryan never understood was that his version of winning required witnesses. Mine never had. He began making plans out loud. Trips. Purchases. Conversations that assumed outcomes already secured. He spoke as though the future had signed off on him. As though access was permanent simply because it had once been easy. I noticed how often he said when instead of if. How rarely he paused. By the end of the night, someone asked whether I'd finally upgraded my car. Ryan answered before I could. She won't, he said lightly. That Toyota suits her. Always has. Laughter followed. Not cruel. Casual. That was worse. I looked at him then. Really looked. He was relaxed, satisfied, already narrating a story where I had faded into a fixed, harmless background detail. Ryan raised his glass and added, almost as an aside, some people just stay where they belong. He believed it. And because he believed it publicly, he never saw the risk he'd just taken. I went home alone that night. Not in a dramatic way. No slammed doors. No replaying conversations out loud. Just the quiet click of the Toyota locking, the familiar smell of the interior, the engine ticking as it cooled. I sat there longer than necessary, hands resting on the steering wheel, letting my breathing slow until it matched something steadier. Silence isn't passive. That's the mistake people make. Silence is work. Inside, I laid my bag on the table and didn't open it right away. I made tea first. Same mug I've used for years. The small routines mattered. They anchored me. When everything around you starts measuring worth in volume and display, discipline becomes the only form of resistance that lasts. I thought about my father then. Not his voice exactly, but the way he handled time. He never rushed decisions that mattered. He believed urgency was often a tactic, not a necessity. If someone needs your answer immediately, he used to say, ask yourself who benefits from the speed. He didn't say it often. He didn't need to. I carried that with me more than I realized. At the table, I opened my bag and took out the documents I'd been avoiding on purpose. Not because they frightened me, but because I didn't want to read them emotionally. Paper doesn't respond well to emotion. It responds to attention. I read slowly. Not once through, but twice. Then again, later. I noted dates, phrasing, assumptions built into the language. The kind of details most people skim because they're impatient to get to the outcome. I wasn't. Ryan thought silence meant surrender. He thought restraint meant fear. That misunderstanding was useful. It gave me room. I reminded myself of something else my father lived by, though he never framed it as advice. He never corrected people when they underestimated him. He let them set their expectations low, then stepped carefully around those expectations when it mattered. It wasn't kindness. It was strategy. I closed the folder and put it away. Not hidden. Just placed where I wouldn't keep touching it. Obsession clouds judgment. Distance sharpens it. From that night on, I made a decision that felt almost boring in its simplicity. I would say less. Not to punish. Not to manipulate. But to preserve clarity. Every word you don't spend in defense can be used later in structure. Days passed. Ryan continued being certain. Chloe continued observing. I continued listening. And then, quietly, without telling anyone why, I opened my calendar and scheduled one meeting. Not urgent. Not dramatic. Just a date, set weeks ahead, at a time that would matter more than anyone realized yet. I closed the calendar and turned off the light, already knowing I wouldn't move it. Thomas Reed didn't ask me why I was there. That was the first thing I noticed, and the thing I respected most. He asked how much time I had, then closed the door to his office and turned his phone face down on the desk, a small gesture that told me he took this meeting seriously. His office was ordinary in the way serious places usually are. Neutral walls. No awards on display. A legal pad already open, pen aligned with its edge. He didn't rush to fill the silence. He let me speak when I was ready. I told him only what was necessary. No emotion. No commentary about Ryan. Just facts, dates, documents. The Toyota never came up. Neither did humiliation. Those things don't belong in rooms like that. Thomas listened the way experienced people do. Not nodding constantly. Not interrupting. Occasionally he would look up, ask a single clarifying question, then go back to his notes. When I finished, he didn't react. He adjusted his glasses and said, "All right," as if we had just agreed on the weather. What followed wasn't dramatic. It was procedural. He explained what could be done, what should be done, and what would be unwise to do. His language was careful. No promises. No assurances of victory. Just a clear outline of steps, dependencies, and timing. At one point he paused and looked at me directly. "You understand," he said, "that once this moves forward, it doesn't stop because someone regrets it." I said I understood. I did. Ryan was still unaware at that moment. That mattered. Not out of spite, but because premature reactions complicate clean processes. Thomas didn't mention my brother by name. He referred to the other party, and that distance felt appropriate. This wasn't personal anymore. It was administrative. We went over signatures. Where they would be required. Where they would not. He pointed out a sequence that had to be followed precisely, or the entire effort would lose its footing. I wrote it down exactly as he said it. Order matters more than intent. When the meeting ended, Thomas stood and shook my hand. Not warmly. Not coldly. Professionally. "I'll prepare the filings," he said. "You'll receive copies. Read them. Don't respond to anything until I advise you to." I nodded. That restraint again. Familiar now. As I left his office, I felt lighter, not because something had happened, but because something had been set in motion without noise. Ryan was still confident. Still careless. Still convinced silence meant nothing was happening. By the time I reached my car, my phone vibrated once. A confirmation email. Subject line short. Neutral. Informational. One step had been finalized. Ryan noticed before I said anything. He always did. He liked to believe he could read rooms faster than other people, that he could feel shifts before they became visible. That day, it showed in the way he leaned back in his chair and watched me instead of talking. "You're quiet," he said, smiling like it was a joke he'd already finished telling. "Even for you." We were standing near the kitchen island at my mother's house. Afternoon light through the blinds. Coffee cooling in mugs no one was drinking. It looked like a normal visit. That was the point. I shrugged lightly. Not dismissive. Not defensive. Just neutral. Busy week. Ryan laughed. Too quickly. Sure. Same here. He glanced down at his phone, then back up at me. You still driving that Toyota? There it was. The same line. Reused. Familiar. Comfortable for him. Yes, I said. He grinned. Relieved. Good. I was worried you might finally snap and buy something sensible. He shook his head like he was amused by the idea. You've always been allergic to upgrades. I didn't correct him. I didn't explain. Silence has a way of letting people hear what they expect. Ryan filled the space easily. He talked about plans, about people I didn't know, about things that sounded impressive if you didn't stop to examine them. I listened the way I always had. Calm. Attentive. Unmoved. At one point, he paused mid-sentence and frowned. You're not mad about anything, right? The question landed softly, but it mattered. He wouldn't have asked it before. I met his eyes. Why would I be? He laughed again, louder this time. I don't know. You've just got this look. He waved his hand vaguely. Like you know something. I smiled, small and polite. You give me too much credit. That unsettled him. I could see it in the way his shoulders shifted, the way his smile tightened at the edges. Confidence depends on feedback. Silence disrupts it. Ryan straightened, trying to recover his rhythm. Everything's fine, he said, more to himself than to me. We're all good. I'm glad, I replied. A beat passed. Then another. He cleared his throat. Hey, he said casually, we're still okay, right? The word okay hung there, heavier than he intended. It was a quiet Thursday morning when the realization began. I had driven my Toyota into the office parking lot as usual, its paint dull, its engine humming predictably. I parked next to the reserved spots near the main entrance, the kind that usually drew attention to the new SUVs and polished sedans. Ryan hadn't arrived yet, and Chloe lingered by the glass wall with her laptop open, pretending to work but watching the entrances, always alert, always judging. Thomas Reed was already at his desk, reviewing quarterly reports with a calm precision that made the room feel smaller, more controlled. Michael Avery stood a few feet away, coffee in hand, silent as always, his eyes flicking between everyone else. The moment the Toyota rolled to a stop, Chloe's head lifted slightly. I noticed the subtle shift, an eyebrow raised, a tightening of her lips. She understood before anyone else what was about to unfold. Ryan stormed in, confident as ever, talking as if the office itself leaned toward him. He walked past my car without a glance, smirking at some imagined superiority. Still driving that thing, he said loudly to no one in particular, the same old line rehearsed for years. Honestly, Eleanor, it's a miracle you haven't broken down on the freeway yet. I didn't respond. I never did. The Toyota was not just a car. It was quiet endurance, reliability, and a reminder of choices I had made deliberately. I had no desire to explain it, to justify it. Silence was enough. Thomas's quiet authority permeated the room. He glanced at the parking lot briefly, then back to his reports. His presence reminded everyone that appearances were secondary to facts, to records, to what could be documented. Michael Avery, standing by the glass, gave no indication that he noticed anything unusual, but his eyes lingered a second longer on the Toyota than they normally would on any vehicle. Subtle acknowledgement, unnoticed by most, but enough to make the atmosphere shift. Chloe finally spoke, soft, almost under her breath, leaning toward the receptionist. I don't think anyone else is noticing, but, that car. She didn't need to finish. The implication was clear. There was significance here that Ryan had missed entirely. Her quiet understanding was sharper than any verbal observation. When Ryan finally noticed the Toyota through the corner of his eye, his expression changed. A small crease formed between his brows, almost imperceptible. The smug certainty he carried everywhere faltered for a moment. He chuckled nervously, trying to cover it. What are you, still, he began, but the words faltered. I watched. I always watched. Not to provoke, not to gloat, but because timing mattered. The truth didn't need shouting. It didn't need dramatics. It needed awareness, patience, and observation. Ryan could sense the shift in the room, the subtle change in how attention was allocated, but he couldn't name it, not yet. The Toyota sat quietly as if it had always been part of the furniture, but its symbolism was unmistakable. Consistency, endurance, a measured pace that contrasted with every impulsive move Ryan had made. Thomas returned to his reports, Michael sipped his coffee, Chloe's lips pressed together in acknowledgement, and I remained still, the observer who did nothing but notice. Minutes passed without a word. Ryan's confidence shrank with every tick of the clock. Chloe's understanding was visible only to those who knew how to read it. Thomas, impartial and precise, offered no hint of interference, letting procedure and circumstance dictate the unfolding narrative. Michael, loyal to his observant nature, stayed silent, letting the weight of attention and perception settle where it should. And there it was, the room had grown smaller, compressed by the quiet revelation. No announcements, no confrontations, no raised voices. The Toyota, mundane to the untrained eye, had shifted the balance. Ryan's presence felt heavier, less assured. Chloe's glance lingered with the knowledge she had already grasped. Thomas remained steady, as though the laws and rules themselves were watching. Michael's stillness reinforced the subtle tension, and I, Eleanor Brooks, maintained the calm center. Silence filled the space, heavier than any noise, carrying the message without a single word spoken. Ryan sat at his usual table in the company's cafe, his coffee cooling faster than he noticed. The room hummed with morning activity, quiet conversations, the scrape of chairs, the clink of spoons against mugs. He had spent so many years assuming visibility was enough, assuming charm and bravado would carry him through every encounter, every meeting, every impression. But today, the hum of the office felt different, almost pointed, almost observing him. He scrolled his phone absent-mindedly, but the notifications now carried a weight he hadn't anticipated. Emails flagged FYI contained references to meetings he hadn't been invited to, conversations he had assumed were casual but were now formalized without him. The tone was polite, factual, procedural, but unmistakably deliberate. The name Eleanor Brooks appeared in subject lines where his had once dominated. He frowned, trying to trace the chain of authority, the logic of who authorized what, but the steps had already been completed. He was late. Whispers followed him through the office hallways, careful, subtle. Colleagues who had once nodded at his jokes now simply smiled with measured civility, careful not to reveal too much, but too composed to mask the shift. The perception he had relied on for years, the easy social dominance, the assumed competence, was eroding quietly, piece by piece. He realized with a creeping tension that Eleanor's absence from confrontation was far more damaging than any outburst could have been. She had done nothing, and that nothing now had a presence. His phone buzzed again. Another alert. The finance team had finalized reports that subtly contradicted his projections. Numbers that he had assumed were flexible, that he had assumed could be leveraged, now stood firm and unalterable. He glanced at the memo headers, his name juxtaposed against hers in ways that made him pause. Policies he had never fully read, clauses he had dismissed, were now procedural blocks he could not undo. The quiet authority of documentation was stacking against him, layer upon layer. Even socially, the shift was palpable. His lunch invite from the regional team had been quietly reassigned to Eleanor. A client, one he had once considered entirely within his orbit, had requested Eleanor as the primary point of contact. He tried to laugh it off with Chloe beside him, but the effort felt hollow. She, ever attentive to image, said nothing, her silence heavier than any verbal criticism. Her disapproval, quiet and precise, was sharper than a confrontation would have been. In the conference room, a subtle ripple of acknowledgement confirmed it further. Michael Avery, normally reserved, made a passing comment about the project alignment with Eleanor's oversight. The remark was casual, meant for no audience, yet Ryan felt its weight immediately. Every subtle indicator compounded: financial precision, professional alignment, social recognition. Eleanor's influence, previously invisible, was now quietly asserting itself across multiple layers of consequence. He ran through the office protocols in his mind, searching for any misstep he could reverse. But the realization hit slowly, coldly. Each document he thought he controlled had already been processed, each approval he assumed was within his reach had been reassigned or overridden. Eleanor had not moved aggressively, she had only moved strategically. Her silence, her measured restraint, had allowed the machinery of procedure and policy to turn against him without a sound. By the time the day edged into afternoon, the breadth of the consequences became clear. clients were responding to Eleanor's emails, not his. Reports he had expected to present at the weekly meeting were now hers to deliver. Mentions in internal communications shifted, subtle but undeniable. The room, the office, even the cityscape beyond the windows seemed slightly altered, smaller, more ordered, less welcoming to him. Ryan tried again to speak with Chloe, to find some reassurance, some way to reclaim footing, but she met his gaze with quiet firmness, unyielding and non-judgmental, leaving him without support. His usual allies had already aligned elsewhere, and the subtle recalibration of respect and authority had begun to cascade without pause. Every unspoken acknowledgement reinforced the truth. The world he had taken for granted was no longer his to navigate at will. By late afternoon, a single observation crystallized in his mind, chilling in its simplicity. Eleanor had done nothing overt, and that nothing had already undone him. No one else needed to act. Her presence, or deliberate absence, was enough. And somewhere in that silence, he felt the first true weight of irreversible change. The office clock ticked, measured and indifferent, marking each second as a quiet reminder. Eleanor's calm had reshaped the landscape around him. There would be no shouting, no dramatic confrontation, no last-minute appeals. The consequences were already in motion, irreversible, and entirely hers. The quiet, patient strategy that he had overlooked now dictated every corner of his day, and he realized, far too late, that he had misjudged her completely. And as he sat there, alone with his coffee cooling beside him, the truth settled in. Eleanor's restraint had been her weapon all along, and its effect was final. Months had passed since the office shift had quietly rearranged itself around me. The Toyota remained in the driveway, unchanged, a reminder of the world I had chosen to inhabit on my own terms. Each morning, I would slide into the driver's seat, the leather worn but steady, the odometer slowly climbing. The simplicity of it no longer felt like limitation, it was clarity. I moved through my routines deliberately, quietly observing the rhythms of the day, noting the minor shifts in colleagues' attitudes, and accepting the subtle respect that came not from boasting, but from consistent presence. The workday had its usual demands, reports, approvals, calls, and occasional meetings. Each interaction reminded me how influence does not always announce itself in grand gestures. Sometimes it arrives in the accumulation of small, correct actions performed without fanfare. I kept my responses measured, professional, and precise. The hum of the office was familiar and grounding, a rhythm I had learned to trust. I understood that patience was a form of authority and silence a kind of power that no loud confrontation could replicate. Lunch breaks were quieter now, often alone, sometimes with a book or a walk around the nearby park. I watched the world go on with its usual motion, aware of how many were consumed by appearances or fleeting judgments. I moved deliberately among them, neither seeking recognition nor hiding, fully present but not performative. Occasionally, I passed the familiar faces of Ryan or Chloe in the hallways. Their greetings were polite, distant, and carefully neutral. There were no dramatic apologies, no lingering conversations, only the subtle acknowledgement that boundaries had shifted and permanence had taken root. Even the documents I had set in motion months before remained precise in their effect. The trust fund decisions, executed with meticulous care, had quietly corrected an imbalance that had long existed. It was a reminder that legal and procedural structures, when understood and respected, can create outcomes that words alone cannot. I often reflected on that lesson, that patience, careful planning, and measured action often achieve far more than emotion-driven confrontation. Each form filed, each approval documented, was a silent echo of restraint, a quiet assertion of long-term vision over immediate satisfaction. Life at home mirrored this quiet order. Meals were simple but intentional, the Toyota parked exactly where I needed it, the daily routine providing structure that felt both protective and empowering. I no longer measured my worth against social commentary or fleeting judgment. The judgment had come and gone. What remained was calm, deliberate space. My mornings began with reflection, my evenings with quiet acknowledgement of the day's rhythms. I understood, more fully than before, that real influence rarely calls attention to itself. It accumulates, unnoticed, until the world adjusts to its presence. I moved through each hour with this in mind, knowing that every choice I had made was deliberate, unseen, but immutable. My life had not been a spectacle, and it never needed to be. The quiet work of observation, patience, and strategic restraint had altered trajectories far beyond the reach of casual mockery or shallow comparison. And as I turned the key in the ignition of the Toyota, feeling its familiar hum beneath me, I allowed a small, calm smile. Not of triumph, not of vindication, but of quiet understanding. Time had revealed what words could not, and life had settled into its steady rhythm. I had learned, conclusively, that true strength is measured not by the attention you command, but by the composure with which you navigate what others underestimate. The driveway stretched ahead, simple and ordinary, yet each measured step through it was a reminder that decisions made quietly, with patience and care, endure far longer than the loudest declarations. And in that enduring calm, I found a clarity few ever understand, a quiet authority that would last long after casual judgments had faded. The lesson was clear: restraint, humility, and deliberate action leave a mark far more permanent than noise. And so I drove on, unhurried, fully aware that the world around me had shifted without a single dramatic moment, and I, unobserved, had quietly ensured it would never return to what it had been.